I was born into a household, into a tradition that was not a peace tradition. My family didn't advocate pacifism in any kind of way. It was assumed that it was okay to take up arms when it was necessary to defend whatever cause was right or just. Yet there was one part of my experience growing up that was different. My sister and I, were prevented from playing with toy guns. We were not allowed to have anything that resembled a gun. We were not allowed to take a stick and turn it into a gun. We were not allowed to have squirt guns. We could have things that squirted at each other that weren't shaped like guns, but they were not allowed to be guns. Guns were not toys. They were to be taken seriously, and people were to be treated with reverence. This was, for me, a crucial piece of my upbringing, and I don't know that my parents had any idea what this would mean for me in my life, but it was a seed that was planted. My parents are now a part of this community, and many of you know them and interact with them, and you can feel free to ask them about this. My dad is right there, and he'd be happy to talk about this. Wouldn't you, Dad? That made an impression on me. Guns are not toys. You don't point them at people. You show reverence to people for the sacred in them. When I was in high school, the government started draft registration again, even though conscription hadn't happened for several years, and the draft registration had stopped. It began again when I was in high school. And so at my high school in Seattle, Washington, a public high school, there was a notice that the Central Committee on Conscious Objectors was going to be hosting an information session to any student who wanted to go there about draft registration. And I thought, oh, I might be a conscious objector. I think I'm going to go to that and see what that's about. So it was quite informative. I remember it vividly in the auditorium of our high school. There were quite a number of us that were there, learning about how you could, even though there wasn't a mechanism for doing so, how you could register as a CO. And I remember going to the post office and getting my card and putting it on there in the upper right-hand corner, like they told me, CO. One thing they said is that it's important to be a part of a tradition that values conscious objection. And if you are part of a religious tradition, to look into that tradition and to write something up about how your faith supports your position of conscious objection. Well, this was interesting to me because I didn't come from a peace church tradition, so I had to think this through. And so I decided that I was going to talk to my pastor, who's also sitting right here. My pastor at the time is also sitting right here in the front, and you can talk to him about this too. And to ask about, is there in our tradition any sort of provision for conscious objection? I had, by conscience, come to believe that it was wrong to kill people. And it turns out that in the Book of Discipline, they call this the Book of Discipline, in the Wesleyan tradition, that's what they call these things, and it made a provision for people who could be conscious objectors. It was not a church that advocated for conscious objection, but it made a provision for it. If you were a person of conscience, that was okay. And this says that our tradition supports people who are conscious objectors. I said, oh, that's really interesting to me. I ended up going to a Quaker school in Newburgh, Oregon, not because it was Quaker or part of a peace church tradition, but because I had friends who went there, which is one of the reasons I suppose we go any place or part of any institution. We have friends. And so I went to this Quaker school, and in my very first year, I enrolled in a class called Peace and War. It wasn't called War and Peace because that would be, you might think it was about Tolstoy, but it was Peace and War. This is what it was called. And I was in over my head. Like we were reading what I know now to be seminary level books in this class. This is over my head for a first year student. Yet it made a real impact on me, and the one lecture that I remember most profoundly was the guest speaker who came to talk about the just war theory. I had heard of just war theory, but I never understood what it was. I never understood that it was this tradition that was designed to put restraints on the powers of the world to do violence. So there were just ways of fighting and just causes, but mostly this system was designed to be kind of a peace tradition, to articulate when you cannot bear arms. And it turns out that if you look at the criteria in just war theory, the vast majority of conflicts, wars, violence that have been done in human history, or since the just war theory was invented, would be unjust. And it occurred to me as I was listening that the just war churches had no idea of any of this. The average person in the pew of a and I'm not going to name, I won't name names, but of a church that advocated or believed in just war theory had no idea what just war theory was, and no idea that it was intended to constrain violence and the participation in war. And this made an impression on me. And it occurred to me that the only churches that were taking seriously Christian tradition, broadly Christian tradition, not just peace church tradition, but Christian tradition broadly, were the peace church traditions. The only people who were tending to this strand in Christian thought were the peace church traditions. And that was a turning point for me. That's when I think, okay, that's where I want to be. That's where I want to go. And so my life began kind of on this trajectory of being in a peace church and having peace theology and valuing that strand within Christian thought. After I finished college, I ended up serving with Mennonite Central Committee. I wasn't a Mennonite, but I'd heard about Mennonites, and I knew people who went with Mennonite Central Committee. I thought, yeah, I think I want to do that. So I applied, and I ended up going to the Philippines. And I've talked about the Philippines, I think, a number of times in sermons, so this is not a surprise. I think back, I was 23 years old when I went to the Philippines, and that's really young. I think that's really young. It seems incredible to me now that Mennonite Central Committee puts people as young and immature as I was in those days in the kinds of situations that we were in. And one situation I was in, this is tricky to talk about, so I'm going to be very careful talking about this, especially with the interwebs and everything that's out there. I was with a group that was traveling deep into the mountains in the Philippines, and this was grueling. This was one of the most grueling days of my life physically to get to this remote location. I think we hiked 14 miles through mountains and a stream, and I was in pain. I was 23 years old. I can't imagine what it'd be like now, but I was in pain from this experience. And we got there and had a night of rest. And the next night, people came to the place where I was staying with guns. They had guns. They weren't toy guns. They were real guns. And I want to be really clear that I felt safe the entire time I was there. I didn't feel any risk of being harmed or kidnapped or anything like that. I felt very safe. but it is still disconcerting to be escorted by people with guns to another place to have a conversation with somebody who was a leader in the underground communist movement. And he knew that I was with Mennonites, and he was interested in me being a pacifist. And he wanted to challenge me on pacifism. One of the tenets of this communist group, this belief, was in the Armadong Pakigbisug sa Katauhan, which means the armed struggle of the people. The only way that you're gonna throw off the yoke of the oppressor is through armed struggle. That was a tenet. And as a Mennonite, representing Mennonites, this is not a tenet that I particularly embraced. And so they wanted to challenge me on that. And one of the ways that I was challenged, which remains unsettling to this day, is that my pacifism comes from a place of comfort. It is, as the young people would say today, a bougie pacifism, a bourgeois pacifism, a comfortable pacifism. It's easy to be a pacifist when you know that every day in your life you won't have to worry about your next meal. It's easy to be a pacifist when you know that your children are not going to die from easily preventable diseases. It's easy to be a pacifist when you know that your children aren't going to be killed by American weapons. And all of these things were things that I witnessed in the Philippines. It's easy to be a pacifist when you know that your life is not going to be subject to grinding poverty every single day. It's easy to reject Armadong Pakigbisug sa Katauhan when that is your life situation. They pushed, right? They pushed. And I conceded, and I still concede, that the most efficient way to throw off an oppressor, to throw off injustice, is with violence. Violence is quite effective and efficient, if that's what you're going for. If you're going for effectiveness and efficiency, violence has its place. My response in those days is my response today, that you do not build peace with guns. That's not how you build real and lasting and true peace. Even so, I am haunted by those conversations, because it is easy for me to say, living as I do, a life of extraordinary comfort and privilege. Those conversations were crucial for me in the sense that I came to take seriously justice. If I was going to be a pacifist, if I was going to say, I'm not going to take up arms against injustice, I needed to be willing to say injustice is wrong and be willing to do something about it. Coming from the Philippines, I ended up at seminary at AMBS in my late 20s and early 30s. And for the first time, really encountered more serious kind of peace theology. And I learned for the first time this word non-resistance. How many people does that resonate with? You know that word, non-resistance. Non-resistance is the word that Mennonites and Anabaptists have used to articulate their peace position. The word pacifism wasn't used really by Mennonites until recently. They chose the word non-resistance. And it's a biblical word. That's why it was chosen. Anabaptists were biblicists. They believed the Bible. And if it wasn't in the Bible, we don't believe it. And so we need something in the word in the Bible, biblical word. And that word, pacifism, is not a word that's in the Bible, right? So we need a biblical word, and that word is non-resistance. And it comes from Matthew chapter 5, which says, do not resist evil. Now this can be read, in seminary, you learn these things. In seminary I learned that it could be read, do not resist the evil one. Do not resist one who is evil. Do not resist evil in the broad sense, or do not resist in an evil way, with an evil manner. Could mean all those different kinds of things. Well, and lots up for grabs with that, right? And how you shade that. But this word non-resistance was a word that I chafed against that word, right? If you go back to my time in the Philippines and my concern for justice, this word non-resistance was not a word that I was eager to embrace. And I had an experience when I was 30 years old of reading this passage that just bothered me to no end. This passage about non-resistance, and as I read, all this business about non-resistance, and you get to the end of Matthew chapter 5. What is it? Anybody know what it's at the very last verse, verse 34? Who can tell me? Ron Kennel, if you were here, you could tell me. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Wow, that's a load and a half, isn't it? Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And I've always hated that. Like, who can be perfect? That's ridiculous. Who can be that? But in this moment, it dawned on me, I realized in this moment that God is perfect. And all these things that have gone on in Matthew 5 here, this business of non-resistance, describes the very character of God and what it means to be God. God's holiness and perfection is characterized, at least in part, by non-resistance. And this took my peace theology in a very different kind of direction. I would say building on, maybe not so much changed the directory, but it built on my peace theology. In the sense that peace theology is not about peace ethics, it's about peace theology. Fundamentally, it's about who God is, and not about who we are and what we do. In more recent years, I've come to describe my position of non-resistance as liturgical pacifism or contemplative pacifism, prayerful pacifism. Because our pacifism doesn't find its meaning in this desire to shape our world, to take our world and to shape it in a particular way. Our pacifism finds its meaning as a response to God. The eternity summons each one of us and summons us as a community to the very heart of God. And our response to that is to be like God. That is, to be resistant, to practice non-resistant. Now that starts to get abstract. So I'll make it a little more concrete. There's a story that's meaningful, I think, to many of us who are Mennonites. The story of Dirk Willems. Dirk Willems was an Anabaptist in the 16th century who was captured and condemned. He was going to be executed, and he managed to escape. And while he was running from his pursuer after he was escaped, he went across the ice, this icy body of water, and he went across cleanly, got all on the other side, and his pursuer fell through the ice. And there he was, in the ice. And you know what Dirk Willems did? Dirk Willems didn't say, "Oh, God has vanquished my enemy, and now I am free to move forward," which is a reasonable thing to say, right? There's a lot in Scripture that would uphold that position. God had protected him. But that's not what he did. He turned around, and he went back to his pursuer and rescued his pursuer. Friends, that's crazy. Isn't it? That's not a rational decision. And the only way that makes sense, there's only one way that makes sense, and there's only one way an act like that has meaning, and that is that it's prayer. It is a response to the summons on Dirk Willems to the very heart of God. And Dirk Willems responded to that summons by saying, yes, I'm going to love my enemies. I'm going to go to the very heart of God. The story has in the terms of our world, a very tragic ending. Against the protests of the man who was rescued, Dirk Willems was executed. He lost his life. Cruelly, I might add. Yet, his act of mercy and kindness has eternal significance. Because Dirk Willems went to the very heart of God. So this is my story. It's an unfolding story. In 10 years, I'm going to tell this story differently, but that's the way I tell the story today. And I thank you for listening.